Welcome to the extremely boring stories. Today we listening the life of Pharaoh Ramesses II. You begin this story not in a palace, but in a quiet, dusty Egypt that has just come out of uncertainty. When Ramesses was born, Egypt was stable, but not relaxed. The country had only recently recovered from the religious chaos caused by Akhenaten's reforms, which had shaken the foundations of temples, priesthoods, and daily worship. Gods had been dismissed, restored, renamed, and argued over. Ordinary people had lived through years of confusion where even prayers felt risky. Stability mattered more than brilliance. Ramesses was not born to be extraordinary. He was not the firstborn son of a long-ruling king. He was not greeted by crowds or hailed as a future legend. His father, Seti I, was a capable military man who became pharaoh later in life, after serving loyally under earlier rulers. This matters, because it shaped the household Ramesses grew up in: disciplined, practical, and deeply focused on restoring order. As a child, Ramesses lived in a world where hierarchy ruled everything. Every morning began with structure. Servants moved quietly. Tutors spoke carefully. Scribes recorded small details: deliveries of grain, the timing of rituals, the condition of storehouses. Even a child in the royal family could not escape this atmosphere of quiet supervision. Someone was always watching, noting, correcting. You can imagine Ramesses learning early that Egypt was not a place you ruled casually. Egypt was a system. A machine powered by agriculture, religion, and paperwork. The Nile flooded on schedule, or else famine followed. Temples required offerings, or else the gods might withdraw their favor. Officials needed instructions, or else corruption spread. A future ruler had to understand routines long before understanding glory. As a boy, Ramesses would have learned to read and write hieroglyphs, but also simpler scripts used for daily administration. This was not poetry for monuments. This was accounting. Grain tallies, worker rosters, temple inventories. These lessons were boring by design, because Egypt survived on boring things done correctly every day. He would have been trained physically as well. Not in dramatic battlefield exercises, but in endurance. Standing still during rituals. Sitting through long ceremonies. Learning to remain calm while incense filled the air and priests recited hymns that lasted longer than a child's attention span. A ruler who fidgeted looked weak. At some point, perhaps quietly, the adults around him realized that Ramesses was likely to inherit power sooner than expected. Seti I's reign, while effective, was not destined to be long. Dynasties in Egypt did not always collapse dramatically. Sometimes they simply passed the torch quickly. This knowledge changed how Ramesses was treated. He began appearing in official reliefs at a young age. Not because he had achieved anything, but because visibility mattered. Egyptians believed seeing reinforced legitimacy. A prince shown beside his father became familiar to the public eye. Familiarity created acceptance. Acceptance created stability. You should pause here and think about how strange that is. Ramesses' childhood was not about freedom or curiosity. It was about preparation. Even play would have been watched. Even mistakes would have been remembered. A child destined for kingship was never just a child. Yet there is something quietly human here. Ramesses likely experienced boredom more than excitement. Long days of instruction. Repeated rituals. Endless reminders of duty. Egypt did not raise dreamers. It raised caretakers of tradition. By his teenage years, Ramesses was already being introduced to military command, not because war was imminent, but because appearances mattered. He accompanied his father on campaigns, watching more than acting. He learned logistics before combat, supply lines before heroics, where water was stored, how rations were counted. Who reported to whom? This kind of learning rarely makes legends, but it makes empires last. When Seti I died, Ramses was still young by modern standards. Yet Egypt did not wait for maturity. Power transferred smoothly. The rituals were performed. The crowns were placed. The names were declared. Overnight, a boy trained in routines became the embodiment of the state. When you return to Ramses after his coronation, the first thing you notice is not confidence, but repetition. Egypt did not expect a new pharaoh to reinvent anything. What it expected, quietly, firmly, was continuity. The same rituals at dawn. The same offerings to the gods. The same phrases spoken in the same order. Ramses stepped into a role that had been rehearsed for centuries, and his earliest years as king were defined less by action and more by learning how not to disturb the balance. You should imagine his days as carefully divided. Morning rituals came first, attended by priests who spoke ancient words that had already outlived many dynasties. These rituals were not symbolic gestures. Egyptians believed they were functional. If the pharaoh failed to perform them correctly, the sun might not rise properly, the Nile might flood unpredictably, or enemies might grow bold. The universe itself depended on routine. Ramses learned quickly that ruling Egypt was not about making decisions all the time. It was about confirming decisions already made by tradition. When reports arrived from officials, he rarely responded with dramatic commands. Instead, he approved, confirmed, or redirected according to precedent. A ruler who disrupted systems invited chaos. Behind the calm exterior, however, something else was happening. Ramses was being watched. Court officials measured him constantly, his posture during ceremonies, his tone when addressing priests, his patience during long meetings. Egypt's elite had survived many rulers. They knew how to wait out weakness. A young pharaoh had to demonstrate steadiness before he could demonstrate authority. This is where the presence of his father mattered most. Seti I had left behind not just monuments and campaigns, but expectations. He had restored order after instability. Ramses inherited a country that wanted reassurance more than innovation. Any misstep would be compared unfavorably to his father's disciplined rule. You can sense the pressure building quietly, without drama. To respond, Ramses leaned heavily on visibility. He appeared often in public rituals. He commissioned reliefs showing himself performing offerings, striking symbolic enemies, and standing confidently beside the gods. These images were not boasts. They were announcements: the system continues, the gods approve. It is important to understand that most Egyptians would never meet Ramses. They would know him through stone carvings, temple walls, and official proclamations read aloud by scribes. Visibility replaced familiarity. Repetition replaced personality. At the same time, Ramses began expanding his household. Royal wives, attendants, scribes, military advisors, each addition was strategic. The palace was not a home, it was an administrative center. Family relationships doubled as political alliances. Loyalty was cultivated slowly, through shared routine rather than emotional closeness. You might expect tension or rebellion in these early years, but Egypt was patient. The machinery of the state absorbed the transition smoothly. Grain continued to move along canals. Taxes were collected. Temples received offerings. Life for ordinary people remained mostly unchanged, and that was the highest compliment a ruler could receive. Still, Ramses was not content to remain only a caretaker. Gradually, almost quietly, he began asserting himself through architecture. Small building projects at first. Restorations rather than grand constructions. Repairs to temples damaged in earlier reigns. These acts signaled respect for tradition while allowing his name to appear alongside the gods. Each inscription reinforced his legitimacy. You should pause here and imagine how slow this process felt. Years passed without dramatic events. No great wars. No sweeping reforms. Just daily governance. Endless petitions. Seasonal rituals. This was not a story of sudden greatness, but of endurance. And endurance shaped Ramesses more than ambition ever could. By his early adulthood, he had mastered the rhythms of kingship. He knew when to speak and when to remain silent. He understood which officials needed firm guidance and which required ceremonial respect. He had learned that power in Egypt did not announce itself loudly, it accumulated quietly. Only after this long apprenticeship did he begin to look outward. Reports from Egypt's borders grew more frequent. The northern territories, particularly in Syria and Canaan, were unstable. Other powers, especially the Hittites, were testing influence. These were not crises yet, but signals. Egypt's dominance was being questioned gently, the way rivals probe before committing. For Ramesses, this was an opportunity wrapped in responsibility. Military action was not about conquest alone. It was about reassurance, showing Egypt's allies that protection still existed, and warning rivals that weakness was only imagined. But before any campaign could begin, there were preparations. Supplies had to be counted. Soldiers had to be trained and rotated. Command structures reviewed. Messages sent to allies. War, like everything else in Egypt, was administrative first. If you stay with Ramesses a little longer, after the early years of his rule have settled into rhythm, you begin to notice something subtle but important. Even as Pharaoh, he is still learning. In Egypt, kingship was not a moment you reached. It was a condition you practiced. Ramesses did not wake each morning thinking of conquest or glory. He woke to schedules. To obligations that had existed long before him and would continue long after. Being Pharaoh meant becoming the most disciplined participant in a system designed to resist change. The crown was not freedom, it was restraint. You should picture his day beginning before sunrise. Not because he wanted to, but because the universe demanded it. The Pharaoh was responsible for maintaining Ma'at, the principle of order, balance, and proper arrangement. This was not philosophy. It was function. If things went wrong, poor harvests, illness, unrest, the failure was assumed to begin at the top. So Ramesses rose early. He washed according to ritual rules. He dressed not for comfort, but for correctness. Linen garments had to be clean, properly folded, properly fastened. Jewelry carried meaning. Crowns were chosen based on the ritual of the day, not personal preference. Every detail mattered because every detail was symbolic. You may find this exhausting just to imagine, and that is the point. Kingship in Egypt was deliberately tiring. Fatigue discouraged recklessness. After preparation came ritual duties. Ramesses did not invent prayers. He recited ancient formulas learned word for word. Priests guided him through movements that had been repeated thousands of times by other rulers. Offerings of bread, beer, incense, and meat were presented to statues of the gods. The statues did not move. The ceremonies still mattered. What you should understand is that these rituals were not optional. They were considered labor. Just as farmers worked the land to ensure crops, the Pharaoh worked the rituals to ensure cosmic stability. Skipping a ritual was like skipping irrigation. Much of Ramesses' early training as Pharaoh involved learning when rituals could be shortened and when they absolutely could not. This knowledge was not written down clearly. It was transmitted through priestly tradition, quiet corrections, and disapproving silences. You learned by doing, and by being watched. Between rituals came administration. This is where the boredom deepens. Scrolls arrived daily. Reports from provincial governors. Temple inventories. Workforce rosters. Complaints from villages about boundary disputes or missing donkeys. Ramesses did not read all of these personally, but he was expected to understand their structure. He needed to recognize when something looked wrong. Scribes would summarize, but summaries could mislead. A skilled ruler learned to ask simple questions that revealed deeper problems. Why were grain shipments delayed? Why did one temple request more linen than usual? Why was a governor praised too often? You might expect excitement here, but instead there was monotony. Egypt functioned because someone cared about small inconsistencies. Ramesses learned to care. At the same time, he continued his education in religious theology. Not belief, procedure. Which god received offerings first during which festival? How regional cults differed. How to honor a moon without offending Ra. How to acknowledge older gods while promoting newer political centers. Religion was diplomacy conducted with the invisible. One of the most demanding parts of Ramesses' training involved festivals. Festivals were long, public, and physically draining. They can last days. The pharaoh walked in processions, stood in the sun, listened to chants repeated again and again. These events were not celebrations for him. They were endurance tests. The people watched everything. If Ramesses appeared weak, tired, or distracted, rumors followed. Strength was not measured by muscle alone, but by stillness. The ability to stand motionless while priests sang. The ability to remain composed while crowds murmured. The ability to endure discomfort without complaint. You can imagine the strain building quietly. No privacy. No casual moments. Even meals were observed. What the pharaoh ate, when he ate, and how much he ate carried meaning. Excess suggested indulgence. Too little suggested illness or divine displeasure. Training did not stop at religion and paperwork. Military instruction continued, though carefully controlled. Ramesses practiced archery, chariot driving, and formation review. But again, this was not about skill alone. It was about symbolism. A pharaoh needed to be seen as capable of leading, even if generals handled details. Inspections of troops followed rigid patterns. Soldiers were lined up. Names were recorded. Equipment was checked. Ramesses learned how to walk the line slowly, how to pause, how to nod. Approval was often silent. Silence conveyed authority. What may surprise you is how little room there was for personal doubt. Egypt had no space for a ruler who openly questioned his role. Any uncertainty had to be absorbed privately. Outwardly, the pharaoh was certainty itself. Yet Ramesses was human. There were nights when rituals ended late and mornings began early. There were days filled entirely with listening. There were years where nothing dramatic happened at all. In those stretches, kingship felt less like destiny and more like maintenance. But maintenance is what kept Egypt alive. As Ramesses moved through his training years, something else became clear. The expectations placed on him were endless, but vague. Be strong, but not disruptive. Be visible, but not familiar. Be divine, but accessible. Be traditional, but effective. No instruction manual explained how to balance these contradictions. So he learned by repetition, by observation, by surviving small mistakes without allowing them to become large ones. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the routines stopped feeling imposed and began to feel natural. The rituals no longer felt foreign. The schedules no longer felt heavy. The role began to fit. This is the quiet transformation most histories skip. Not the moment of coronation, not the battlefield victory, but the long period where a person disappears into an office so completely that the office defines them. As time passes, you notice that learning to be Pharaoh is no longer about instruction. It becomes about judgment. By this stage in Ramses' life, the priests no longer correct him openly. The scribes no longer explain every document. The generals wait to see his reaction before offering their own opinions. This silence is deliberate. Egypt expects its ruler not to ask what to do, but to recognize what must be done. You can imagine how quiet authority feels different from training. Earlier, Ramses followed rules. Now, he interprets them. Rituals still dominate his mornings, but the emphasis has shifted. He no longer struggles to remember sequences. Instead, he must decide which rituals deserve emphasis during times of stress. When reports of border tension arrive, offerings to protective gods become more visible. When harvests are uncertain, fertility rites are expanded. These choices are political, religious, and psychological all at once. The people may not understand the logic, but they feel the reassurance. Administrative life grows heavier. Egypt's bureaucracy is vast, and it never rests. Regional governors compete subtly for favor. Temples argue over land boundaries that stretch back generations. Work crews request additional rations, claiming exhaustion or injury. Every request is phrased respectfully, but many hide ambition, fear, or deception. Ramses learns that saying yes too often weakens authority, but saying no too bluntly breeds resentment. So he masters delay. Decisions are postponed, reframed, or redirected to committees. Power flows not through commands, but through pacing. This is where boredom becomes strategic. You should picture Ramses sitting through long councils where nothing seems to happen. Voices rise and fall. Arguments circle familiar ground. The pharaoh listens more than he speaks. Officials reveal themselves through patience or impatience. The talk itself is less important than how people behave while talking. Military training also deepens, but again, quietly. Ramses no longer practices only technique. He studies maps. Not decorative ones, but practical sketches of terrain, water sources, and travel times. Campaign planning is slow and unglamorous. Supplies must arrive before soldiers. Roads must exist before movement. Victories depend on food more than courage. You can almost feel how this knowledge reshapes him. War becomes a logistical exercise first, an ideological one second. Heroism is reduced to endurance. At the same time, Ramses' public image grows more deliberate. Titles accumulate. Epithets are chosen carefully. Beloved of the moon. Strongbull. These phrases are repeated on monuments not because they describe reality, but because repetition creates reality in the public mind. This is a skill Ramses learns well, how words, repeated often enough, shape belief. Festivals grow larger. Processions become longer. The pharaoh appears increasingly confident, even serene. To the people, this suggests divine approval. To insiders, it suggests mastery of performance. The two are not separate. Yet beneath this smooth exterior, challenges quietly accumulate. The expectations placed on Ramses are no longer limited to Egypt itself. Allies expect protection. Vassal states expect reassurance. Rivals test boundaries. Letters arrive from distant rulers written in polite language that masks threat. Diplomacy becomes a constant background hum. Responding to these messages requires balance. Too much force provokes war. Too much caution invites disrespect. Ramses learns to reply with gifts, promises, and carefully worded assurances. Often, the true meaning lies not in what is said, but in what is omitted. You might expect stress to show, but Egypt does not allow visible strain. Ramesses adapts by becoming more formal, more distant. Personal emotion recedes. The role hardens around him like a shell. This transformation affects his personal life as well. Family relationships become ceremonial. Wives fulfill ritual roles. Children are introduced publicly as symbols of continuity. Affection exists, but it is structured. Even grief, when it comes, must be expressed correctly. The longer Ramesses rules, the more difficult it becomes to separate the man from the office. Decisions feel less personal. Responsibility feels less optional. What once felt like training now feels inevitable. And then something shifts. The borders grow louder. Reports stop being tentative and become urgent. The northern territories, especially those influenced by the Hittites, demand attention. Egypt's authority is no longer assumed. It must be demonstrated. For the first time, Ramesses faces a choice that cannot be delayed or delegated. He must decide not just how to rule, but how to act beyond Egypt's walls. When you arrive at this part of Ramesses' life, the crown no longer feels ceremonial. It feels heavy. By now, Ramesses II is fully pharaoh, not in title, but in habit. The rituals no longer teach him. The bureaucracy no longer surprises him. The people no longer watch to see if he belongs. They assume he does. And that assumption carries its own burden. The double crown of Egypt, symbolizing Upper and Lower Egypt, is not simply worn. It is carried, mentally, at all times. To rule Egypt is to hold together two landscapes, two traditions, and countless local loyalties that only appear unified from a distance. Up close, Egypt is a collection of villages, temples, irrigation systems, and fragile agreements. You begin to notice that Ramesses' days grow longer, not because he chooses them to be, but because responsibility expands naturally. More reports arrive. More officials seek approval. More temples require maintenance. The state grows because it is functioning well, and functioning systems tend to grow. This is where kingship becomes quiet pressure. The crown demands visibility, but also consistency. Ramesses must be seen often enough to reassure, but not so often that his presence loses meaning. He travels deliberately. When he visits a city, the visit is announced weeks in advance. Streets are cleaned. Temples prepared. Local officials rehearse their speeches. These journeys are not spontaneous. They are logistical operations designed to remind people that the pharaoh exists everywhere, even when he is absent. As you imagine these travels, notice how little personal freedom remains. Every movement is observed. Every pause interpreted. A moment of silence might be read as wisdom, or displeasure. A brief smile might become a rumor. The pharaoh learns to manage his own expression as carefully as he manages the state. Inside the palace, power becomes layered. Ramesses is no longer surrounded by teachers, but by specialists. High priests, military commanders, chief scribes, architects. Each speaks confidently within their domain. Each expects the pharaoh to understand just enough to approve decisions without interfering unnecessarily. Too much involvement suggests mistrust. Too little suggests weakness. So Ramesses listens. He listens to reports about stone quarries far from the capital. About labor shortages during flood season. About temples requesting land exemptions. About border towns reporting unfamiliar traders who may also be spies. None of this is dramatic. All of it matters. What becomes clear is that Egypt does not collapse through sudden disasters. It erodes through neglected details. This realization shapes Ramesses' approach to authority. He becomes methodical. He prefers systems to individuals, written records to spoken promises, repetition to innovation. These choices do not make legends quickly, but they make longevity possible. And longevity is becoming important. By this stage, Ramesses begins to understand something unsettling. Most pharaohs are remembered briefly, if at all. Names fade. Statues are repurposed. Monuments are overwritten. Eternity is promised, but rarely delivered. This knowledge does not make him anxious. It makes him deliberate. You start to see a change in how he presents himself. Titles grow longer. Epithets more confident. His name appears larger on monuments. Earlier kings' names are sometimes replaced with his own. This is not vanity in the modern sense. It is insurance. In Egypt, survival after death depends on memory. The crown teaches Ramesses that power does not end when life does. At the same time, the physical reality of the crown presses in. Festivals are more frequent. Public appearances more demanding. The pharaoh must stand for hours, ride in processions, speak blessings, perform gestures slowly and precisely. Fatigue is not an excuse. Illness is hidden and less severe. A weak king invites instability. You can almost feel the strain accumulating quietly, year by year. The palace itself reflects this tension. It is large, but controlled. Private spaces are limited. Walls are decorated not for comfort, but for messaging. Scenes of order, abundance, and divine favor repeat endlessly. The pharaoh lives inside a reminder of what he is supposed to represent. Outside the palace, Egypt remains calm, but watchful. The Nile continues its cycles. Farmers plant and harvest. Artisans carve stone. Scribes copy texts that have been copied before. Life feels steady, and that steadiness is attributed to Ramesses' rule. Success becomes invisible. Only failure would be noticed. This creates a dangerous paradox. The better Ramesses rules, the more is expected of him. Stability raises the standard. Any disruption now feels like betrayal rather than misfortune. As the years pass, Ramesses' confidence grows, but so does his isolation. Few people speak to him without caution. Fewer still speak honestly. Information becomes filtered. Complaints are softened. Praise becomes louder than necessary. The crown protects, but it also separates. This separation matters most when foreign affairs press closer. Beyond Egypt's borders, other rulers rule differently. They negotiate openly. They boast. They threaten. They test. Egypt's quiet confidence can be mistaken for passivity. Ramesses begins receiving messages that are politely worded, yet unmistakably probing. Borders are mentioned. Alliances hinted at. Neutrality questioned. These letters are read aloud by scribes in measured tones, but their implications linger long after the words fade. The crown does not allow uncertainty to show. As the weight of the crown settles more firmly on Ramesses' life, something subtle changes in how Egypt expects him to behave. The pharaoh is no longer merely a symbol of stability. He is now expected to prove it. You can sense this shift not through proclamations, but through tone. Reports from officials carry urgency where there was once calm. Priests speak more insistently about proper offerings. Generals request clearer guidance. None of them say the crown is heavy, but they all act as if it must now be carried forward, not just balanced. This is the stage where kingship becomes less about maintenance and more about judgment under pressure. Ramesses spends more time in consultation. but fewer people are present. Councils grow smaller. Discussions become quieter. Decisions are made without witnesses. Authority, once public and ceremonial, turns inward and controlled. The Pharaoh learns that not every act of leadership benefits from visibility. You begin to notice how carefully information reaches him. Messages from distant regions arrive summarized, softened, and arranged. Scribes choose words that reduce alarm. Governors frame problems as manageable. Even warnings are delivered politely. This is not deception, it is survival. Officials understand that panic spreads quickly in centralized systems. Ramesses, however, learns to read between lines. He studies patterns instead of phrases. A rise in grain requests from one region suggests crop issues. Repeated complaints from different villages indicate administrative failure. Silence from a usually vocal governor hints at unrest. The crown teaches him to listen to absence as much as presence. Public life continues with ritual precision. Festivals are celebrated. Temples are expanded. Reliefs are carved showing the pharaoh strong, youthful, unchanging. These images freeze time intentionally. Egypt does not like reminders that rulers age. But Ramesses does age, quietly. The physical demands of kingship accumulate. Long ceremonies strain the body. Travel exhausts. Injuries take longer to heal. None of this is acknowledged publicly. A pharaoh showing weakness risks destabilizing belief itself. So Ramesses adjusts his movements, his posture, his pacing, adapting without admitting change. This adaptation extends to governance. Where he once reviewed details personally, he now delegates more. Trusted officials gain influence. Titles are awarded not just for service, but for loyalty. The bureaucracy grows more complex, because complexity allows continuity when the ruler must conserve energy. This does not mean Ramesses withdraws. It means he becomes selective. You might expect this phase to feel triumphant. After all, Ramesses is powerful, experienced, secure. But the reality is quieter. Power, once achieved, becomes something to preserve rather than expand. The fear is no longer failure, it is erosion. And erosion comes from complacency. Beyond Egypt's borders, other powers do not share this patience. They watch Egypt closely. They notice patterns. They test responses. A delayed reply here, a softened message there. These small signals accumulate in foreign courts. Ramesses receives letters that are polite but probing. Requests for clarification. Proposals for alliances framed as mutual benefit. Offers of gifts that imply expectation. Each letter must be answered carefully. Too much enthusiasm signals need. Too much restraint signals weakness. Diplomacy becomes a performance as controlled as ritual. Inside Egypt, the people continue their routines largely unaware of these pressures. Farmers tend fields. Artisans carve stone. Life remains predictable, and predictability reinforces trust. Ramesses understands that preserving this normality is his most important task. But preserving normality requires action behind the scenes. The military is reorganized quietly. Units are rotated. Commanders are reassigned. Supplies are stockpiled discreetly. Roads are repaired under the justification of trade. None of this is announced as preparation for war. Egypt does not advertise anxiety. You can imagine Ramesses reviewing reports late into the night, not in urgency, but in calculation. Each decision must align with tradition, expectation, and long-term stability. Bold moves risk disruption. Passive ones risk decline. The crown does not allow simple answers. At the same time, Ramses' image grows more imposing. Statues become larger. Inscriptions more assertive. His name appears more frequently, carved deeper into stone. This is not ego, it is strategy. In Egypt, permanence equals legitimacy. If his image endures, so does the idea of order. You begin to see how the crown reshapes time itself. The present matters less than how it will be remembered. Ramses plans not just for years, but for centuries. He builds not to impress the living, but to instruct the future. Yet no amount of planning removes uncertainty. Foreign powers continue to press gently. Border reports grow more frequent. Alliances shift. Egypt's dominance is no longer unquestioned, it must be demonstrated. The pharaoh cannot ignore this forever without risking the appearance of retreat. The double crown, once a symbol of unity within Egypt, now represents responsibility beyond it. Ramses stands at a quiet crossroads. His reign is stable. His authority is accepted. His image is secure. But the world around Egypt is changing, and stability alone may no longer be enough. When you step inside the royal court of Ramses II, you do not enter a place of loud commands or dramatic confrontations. You enter a space shaped by routine, proximity, and quiet observation. The court is where Egypt actually runs. It is easy to imagine the pharaoh ruling alone from a throne, but in reality, Ramses is surrounded almost constantly. Not by equals, but by people whose closeness gives them influence. Scribes, wives, attendants, priests, guards, each occupies a position carefully defined by custom. No one speaks out of turn. No one moves without reason. And yet, this is where power shifts most subtly. The scribes are everywhere. They stand slightly apart, holding writing palettes, recording decisions that may seem small at the moment but will shape policy long after the conversation ends. A scribe's task is not only to write, but to frame. How an event is recorded determines how it will be remembered, and Ramses understands this well. You might notice how carefully he speaks in these settings. His words are deliberate, measured, and often brief. A single phrase can authorize land transfers, temple endowments, or administrative changes that affect thousands. The scribes capture these phrases exactly, or at least, exactly as tradition allows. To rule Egypt is to rule through documentation. The court also includes the royal women, whose presence is constant but often misunderstood. Ramses has multiple wives, as expected of a pharaoh. But their roles are structured rather than romantic. Chief among them is the great royal wife, whose status carries ritual importance. She appears in ceremonies, participates in religious observances, and represents continuity. You should not assume passivity here. Royal wives manage estates, oversee temple activities, and maintain networks of loyalty within the palace. Their influence does not come from public speech, but from access. They hear conversations. They notice changes in mood. They pass information quietly. In a court where everyone listens carefully, silence can be a form of power. The palace itself is arranged to encourage this silence. Corridors are long. Rooms are layered inward. Access is controlled. Not everyone can approach the pharaoh directly, and those who can do so understand the privilege. A short audience may be more valuable than a long meeting if it occurs at the right moment. You begin to see how decision-making works here. Problems are rarely presented as problems. They arrive disguised as updates, observations, or ritual concerns. A temple requests additional workers, not because it lacks labor, but because it wants more land. A scribe mentions delays, not to complain, but to signal administrative weakness elsewhere. Ramesses listens, and often says very little. This restraint confuses outsiders. Some mistake it for indecision. But within the court, silence is read carefully. A pause can indicate disapproval. A nod can suggest permission. A delayed response can redirect an entire policy without open confrontation. The court thrives on these unspoken cues. Personal relationships within the palace are complex, but controlled. Friendship exists, but it is never unguarded. Loyalty is valued, but tested over time. Officials rise slowly, often after decades of service. Sudden promotion is rare and suspicious. You can imagine how tiring this environment becomes. Every interaction carries weight. Every word might be recorded. Every gesture observed. Privacy is limited. Even moments of rest occur within a framework of expectation. Yet Ramesses adapts. He learns to compartmentalize. Public behavior becomes automatic. Personal thoughts are kept internal. Emotion is expressed through ritual rather than conversation. When frustration arises, it is redirected into activity, building projects, ceremonial planning, or administrative review. The court also serves another purpose: continuity. Officials who served previous pharaohs continue under Ramesses. This stability reassures the elite. It also constrains innovation. Change must be gradual, justified, and framed as restoration rather than reform. You begin to see how power in Egypt moves sideways rather than forward. Influence shifts through proximity, favor, and access, not through open competition. The court is less a battlefield than a balancing act. As Ramesses navigates this environment, his authority grows more refined, but also more dependent on the people around him. No ruler governs alone, and in Egypt, dependence is carefully disguised as harmony. The longer Ramesses rules, the more the court becomes a living system rather than a collection of individuals. Information flows predictably. Decisions follow established paths. Disruption is absorbed and redirected. And yet, beneath this calm structure, tensions exist. Rivalries remain unspoken. Ambitions are concealed. Loyalties shift quietly. As time passes, you begin to notice that the court does not simply serve the pharaoh. It shapes him. Ramesses moves through the palace with practiced ease now. He knows which corridors lead to conversation and which lead to ceremony. He knows where to pause, where to linger, and where to pass quickly without inviting discussion. The palace has taught him its rhythms, and in return, it demands his attention every day. Power here is not loud. It is layered. Scribes continue to record everything, but what they choose to emphasize becomes increasingly important. A minor temple donation might receive a full inscription. A disagreement between officials might be reduced to a polite summary. Over time, the written record begins to smooth reality, presenting Egypt as orderly even when strain exists beneath the surface. Ramesses understands this danger. He requests oral reports alongside written ones. He listens to tone, hesitation, and phrasing. He asks the same question to different people on different days. Consistency becomes a measure of truth. Still, he cannot see everything. The royal women remain a constant presence, but their influence becomes more intricate. Senior wives manage household hierarchies. Younger wives observe and learn. Rivalries are subtle, expressed through seating arrangements, ceremonial roles, or access to certain festivals. None of this is openly acknowledged, yet all of it affects how information reaches the pharaoh. You should imagine how carefully these relationships are maintained. A misplaced favor can upset balance. A public gesture can elevate one household at the expense of another. Ramesses learns to distribute attention evenly, not out of affection, but out of political necessity. Children move through the court as symbols rather than individuals. Sons are watched closely. Daughters are presented ceremonially. Each child represents continuity, but also potential complication. Succession in Egypt is rarely dramatic in the moment, it becomes dramatic later, when ambiguity exists. So Ramesses emphasizes clarity. Titles are assigned. Lineage is displayed in reliefs. Ritual roles are formalized. The court becomes a stage where legitimacy is rehearsed continuously. The servants and attendants, though rarely mentioned in inscriptions, are vital to the court's functioning. They observe everything. They carry messages. They hear conversations half spoken behind screens. Their loyalty is secured through stability rather than reward. Long service is valued. Familiarity breeds trust. You begin to see how information moves upward in fragments. A servant mentions a delay. An attendant notices tension. A scribe records a hesitation. Individually, these details mean little. Together, they form patterns that only the Pharaoh, or those very close to him, can see. Ramesses relies heavily on routine to manage this complexity. Audiences are scheduled. Petitions are grouped. Ceremonial days are separated from administrative ones. Structure limits surprise. Surprise is dangerous. Yet even structure cannot eliminate uncertainty. Occasionally, a silence lasts too long. An official delays a report. A priest avoids a topic. These moments draw Ramesses' attention more than complaints ever could. Silence in the court is rarely accidental. When he senses this, Ramesses does not confront it directly. He waits. He asks unrelated questions. He shifts responsibilities. Time reveals intentions better than pressure. This approach makes the court feel calm, even serene. Outsiders describe it as harmonious. But harmony here is maintained through constant adjustment. Like irrigation channels, power must be redirected continuously to prevent overflow. The longer Ramesses rules, the more he understands that the court is not a tool, it is an environment. He cannot control it completely. He can only move within it skillfully. This realization changes how he sees himself. He is no longer simply the center of power. He is the anchor that prevents drift. Too much movement from him destabilizes the system. Too little allows others to move unchecked. Balance becomes his defining skill. As external pressures grow, foreign diplomacy, border tensions, shifting alliances, the court absorbs the strain quietly. Discussions become more frequent, but less visible. Decisions are framed as ritual necessity rather than political response. Egypt does not admit anxiety openly. You can feel how this containment of tension becomes both strength and vulnerability. The court keeps Egypt stable, but it also delays acknowledgement of problems until they demand action. Ramesses senses this, even if he cannot name it. He stands at the center of a palace that functions beautifully, until it doesn't. Every system works, but only because it assumes tomorrow will resemble today. Not metaphorically, literally. Everywhere you look, Egypt is being carved, measured, hauled, and shaped. Blocks of limestone slide along sledges. Granite waits at quarries hundreds of miles away. Architects argue quietly over proportions. Scribes count workers, rations, days. Nothing here feels sudden. Everything feels deliberate. Ramesses is building eternity, one tedious decision at a time. You might expect monument building to come from vanity, but in Egypt, construction is administration. Temples are not decorations. They are economic centers, religious engines, and political statements combined. A temple employs priests, guards, artisans, cooks, cleaners, and accountants. It stores grain. It owns land. It redistributes wealth. To build a temple is to anchor control. Ramesses understands this deeply. He does not begin with the most ambitious projects. He starts with restorations. Older temples damaged by neglect or time are repaired. Names of earlier kings are carefully recarved, sometimes replaced. This is not erasure so much as correction. In Egyptian thinking, a monument that bears your name keeps you alive. Updating it transfers endurance. You should imagine how slow this process feels. Weeks of planning for months of work. Months of work for years of use. Years of use for centuries of memory. The rhythm of building is intentionally dull. Dullness prevents mistakes. Stone must be sourced carefully. Limestone from nearby quarries for walls and reliefs. Sandstone for temples in Upper Egypt. Granite from Aswan for statues and obelisks. Difficult, expensive, and dangerous to transport. Choosing granite is not a design decision. It is a statement of commitment. Transporting stone is one of the least glamorous parts of empire. Workers pull sledges across prepared tracks. Water is poured ahead to reduce friction. Progress is measured in meters per day. Scribes record everything. Losses are expected. Delays are normal. No one rushes stone. Ramesses pays close attention to these logistics. Not because he visits quarries often, but because reports reach him constantly. How many workers fell ill? How many blocks cracked? How long the Nile flood delayed transport? These details determine whether a monument is finished in a lifetime or abandoned half-complete. And abandonment is dangerous. An unfinished monument suggests failure. As projects multiply, Ramesses' name spreads across Egypt. Temple pylons, courtyard walls, colossal statues, all bearing his cartouche. This repetition is intentional. Memory requires density. A single monument can be ignored. Hundreds cannot. You begin to understand that Ramesses is not trying to be remembered once. He is trying to be unavoidable. The most famous projects, like the great temples at Abu Simbel, are not chosen randomly. Their placement matters. Abu Simbel faces Nubia, projecting power toward the south. The statues are enormous, but their message is quiet and constant. Egypt is present. Egypt is watching. Egypt endures. Inside these temples, reliefs depict victories, rituals, offerings. The scenes repeat familiar themes. Ramesses is shown larger than others, not to deceive, but to reinforce hierarchy. Scale replaces narrative. Proportion replaces explanation. The everyday labor behind these monuments is rarely depicted, but it dominates reality. Thousands of workers rotate through projects seasonally. They are not slaves in the popular imagination, but organized laborers, fed, housed, recorded. Absenteeism is punished. Injury is documented. Death is expected. Building eternity is exhausting. Ramesses rarely sees the work directly. He experiences it through reports, models, and ceremonial inspections. When he does visit, the visit itself becomes ritual. Workers are organized. Progress is displayed. Tools are cleaned. The appearance of order matters as much as order itself. You might think this distance disconnects him from reality, but it does the opposite. It forces him to trust systems rather than impulse. Stone does not respond to enthusiasm. It responds to planning. As more monuments rise, something else happens quietly. Egypt's economy adjusts around construction. Quarries expand. Transport networks improve. Skilled artisans gain status. Entire communities exist to support a single building project. These changes ripple outward slowly, stabilizing some regions while straining others. Ramesses must balance this carefully. Build too much, and agriculture suffers. Build too little, and authority fades. There is no formula, only experience. At night, when rituals end and audiences fade, Ramesses lies surrounded by reminders of permanence. Walls carved with scenes of timeless order. Statues that do not age. Inscriptions that speak in present tense forever. You can imagine the strange comfort and pressure this creates. Stone does not forgive mistakes. Once carved, it remembers. And so Ramesses becomes cautious, but persistent. He chooses longevity over speed. Visibility over novelty. Repetition over originality. As decades pass, Egypt begins to look like Ramesses, his name everywhere, his image familiar, his presence assumed even where he is not. Yet beneath this apparent permanence lies an uneasy truth: stone lasts longer than people, but not longer than time. As the building projects multiply, you begin to see how construction reshapes not only Egypt's landscape, but Ramesses himself. What started as restoration becomes expansion. What began as careful planning becomes long-term obligation. Once stone is set in motion, it does not stop easily. A temple half-built demands completion. A quarry open must remain productive. Workers trained for stone cannot be returned easily to the fields without consequence. Building creates momentum. Ramesses learns that monuments, once imagined, begin to rule the ruler. He now spends more time reviewing architectural plans than battle reports. Not because war has faded, but because stone requires constant attention. A slight miscalculation in foundation depth can crack walls decades later. A poorly chosen inscription can offend a priesthood. A misaligned axis can disrupt ritual processions forever. Every decision must consider generations that will never know his voice, only his stone. You might imagine these decisions being grand and creative, but most are repetitive. Which god receives prominence on which wall? Which titles appear in which order? Which earlier kings are acknowledged, and which are quietly overwritten? These choices are debated slowly, often revisited, rarely finalized quickly. The pharaoh listens patiently. Stone does not tolerate impatience. One of the most important lessons Ramesses learns during this period is restraint. Not every successful reign leaves the same architectural mark. Egypt remembers builders differently than conquerors. Builders are measured in endurance. Conquerors are measured in memory. Memory fades faster. This understanding shapes Ramesses' priorities. Military victories are carved, yes, but always framed within ritual scenes. The gods grant success. The pharaoh receives it properly. There is no chaos in stone, even if chaos existed in reality. This careful framing creates a version of Egypt that feels timeless. Visitors walking through temples decades later will not know which year was difficult or which harvest failed. They will see continuity. That is the purpose. But continuity has a cost. Labor demands grow heavier. Villages near quarries lose workers seasonally. Fields are left understaffed during flood seasons. Overseers report fatigue, illness, occasional unrest. These reports reach the palace filtered and softened. But Ramesses recognizes the pattern. He responds cautiously. Rations are adjusted. Rotations modified. Some projects slow. Others pause. Not publicly, quietly. Egypt does not announce reduction. It absorbs it. You begin to see how building becomes negotiation. Between ambition and capacity. Between legacy and livelihood. between what looks eternal and what must survive the present. Temples, meanwhile, grow into powerful institutions of their own. Once built, they require maintenance. Priests expect funding. Estates must be managed. Festivals must be supported. A completed temple is never finished. It becomes a permanent demand on the state. Ramesses understands this, and it tempers his choices. He prefers building in strategic locations, places where temples will reinforce authority, stabilize borders, or strengthen key cults. Stone is placed where it will work the hardest. Even so, the sheer scale of construction changes how people experience his reign. For ordinary Egyptians, Ramesses becomes less a person and more a presence. His name appears everywhere, on walls, gates, statues, boundary markers. Children grow up assuming Egypt has always looked this way. This familiarity breeds acceptance. Acceptance breeds loyalty. But there is another effect, quieter and more personal. As Ramesses ages, he becomes increasingly aware that stone will outlive him. This awareness does not produce fear, but calculation. He revisits earlier projects, orders repairs while he is still alive, ensures inscriptions are clear and complete. In Egypt, a damaged name is a damaged afterlife. He prepares stone the way others prepare tombs. At times, this focus narrows his world. Living people feel temporary compared to carved walls. Daily disputes seem small next to monuments designed to last forever. This is not arrogance, it is adaptation to scale. Yet life continues around the stone. Workers return home after seasons of labor. Priests age and are replaced. Scribes copy inscriptions that already exist. Egypt moves forward even as it tries to appear unchanged. Ramesses stands at the center of this contradiction, a living man orchestrating permanence. When you turn away from temples and stone, and step fully inside the royal palace, the world becomes smaller, quieter, and more repetitive. This is where Ramesses II actually lives. Not where he is remembered, not where he is carved into granite, but where his days are spent. And those days, surprisingly, are filled less with command and more with routine. The palace is not a single building. It is a cluster of courtyards, halls, storerooms, shrines, offices, and living quarters, all arranged to control movement and attention. Corridors bend. Rooms open inward. Screens divide space without fully closing it. Privacy exists, but only in degrees. You should imagine mornings beginning before the city fully wakes. Light enters the palace gradually, filtered through courtyards and shaded walls. Servants move quietly. Schedules are already set. Nothing here begins spontaneously. Ramesses' first hours are structured almost entirely by ritual and preparation. Washing follows prescribed forms. Clothing is selected according to the day's requirements. Ritual days differ from administrative days. Linen must be clean, pressed, correct. Jewelry is symbolic, not decorative. Each piece communicates status, role, and divine alignment. These preparations are not hurried. Speed suggests disorder. Order suggests control. Meals are simple by royal standards. Bread, beer, fruit, vegetables, occasionally meat. Excess is discouraged, not for health, but for appearance. A pharaoh who indulges invites rumors of weakness or moral imbalance. Even eating is a public act, observed by attendants trained to notice changes. After preparation comes the long middle of the day, the part history rarely describes. This is when Ramesses listens. Petitions are brought forward, summarized by scribes. Reports from provinces arrive in batches. Temple accounts are reviewed. Workforce numbers are confirmed. Most of this does not require decision-making, only acknowledgement. Egypt runs because acknowledgement happens reliably. You might expect boredom here, and you would be right. But boredom is functional. It creates predictability. Predictability creates trust. Between these administrative moments, Ramesses moves through spaces designed for waiting. Courtyards where nothing happens except observation. Halls where officials stand silently until addressed. Shrines where incense burns steadily without variation. These spaces slow time deliberately. Inside the palace, sound is controlled. Loud voices are rare. Footsteps are soft. Announcements are formal. Even laughter is measured. The palace is not a place for expression, it is a place for containment. The royal household operates continuously around Ramesses. Attendants manage clothing. Servants manage food. Guards rotate shifts. Scribes copy records that have already been approved. Everyone knows their role. Deviations are noticed immediately. You begin to see how this environment shapes behavior. Emotion is internalized. Impulses are delayed. Reactions are softened. The palace trains its inhabitants to think before acting, not because thinking is noble, but because acting carelessly disrupts order. Family life exists, but it follows the same pattern. Royal wives maintain separate households within the palace complex. They oversee staff, manage estates, and participate in ceremonies. Contact with Ramesses is regular but structured. Conversations are rarely private in the modern sense. Walls may block sight, but not hearing. Children move through the palace under supervision. Tutors instruct them. Servants guide them. They are seen often, but known less. Childhood here is ceremonial preparation, not exploration. Ramesses experiences fatherhood as responsibility rather than intimacy. He ensures education, titles, visibility. Affection exists, but it is expressed through stability rather than closeness. As the day progresses, rituals return. Offerings are made. Gods are acknowledged again. The cycle repeats, not because repetition is comforting, but because repetition is necessary. The universe depends on it, or so Egypt believes. Evenings in the palace are not restful. They are quieter, but still structured. Final reports are reviewed. Tomorrow's schedule is confirmed. Servants adjust lighting. Guards change shifts. The palace never sleeps, it only slows. Ramesses ends most days not exhausted, but constrained. There is little room for reflection without interruption. Even solitude occurs within known boundaries. A pharaoh alone is still watched. This daily life creates a strange tension. Everything is controlled, yet nothing feels complete. Every task leads to another. Every ritual repeats. Time stretches, not dramatically, but endlessly. You can imagine how decades pass like this, days blending into one another, marked only by festivals, construction milestones, and foreign messages. Life inside the palace is not exciting. It is enduring. And endurance shapes Ramesses as much as ambition ever could. As you remain inside the palace a little longer, you begin to understand that routine is not merely habit here, it is protection. The palace shields Ramesses from unpredictability by smoothing every edge of the day. Nothing arrives without warning. Nothing departs without record. Even surprise is managed through protocol. This is not paranoia. It is necessity. Egypt's ruler must remain available at all times, and availability requires control. Midday in the palace is often the most crowded part of the day, though it rarely feels busy. Officials rotate in and out with quiet efficiency. Each has a narrow purpose. One delivers temple inventories. Another reports workforce numbers. Another confirms grain storage levels. None stay long. Lingering suggests uncertainty. Ramesses listens without interruption. You might expect a ruler to speak more, to command and correct, but by now Ramesses has learned that speaking too often creates confusion. His authority lies in confirmation. When he nods, systems move. When he delays, systems pause. The palace is attuned to his smallest gestures. This economy of motion extends to his own body. Ramesses sits upright, still, controlled. Sudden movements attract attention. Attention invites interpretation. Interpretation can become rumor. So stillness becomes habit. Meals are taken at set times, often alone or with minimal company. Food is inspected, not out of fear, but out of ritual cleanliness. The pharaoh eats enough to sustain, not enough to indulge. Excess is corrected quietly by attendants trained to adjust portions without comment. You begin to notice how much of palace life is designed to eliminate choice. Choices create risk. Schedules eliminate them. When Ramesses moves from one space to another, attendants precede him. Doors open before he reaches them. Paths are clear. Conversations pause. This constant accommodation reinforces hierarchy, but it also isolates. Interaction becomes one-directional. You can imagine how rarely Ramesses hears unfiltered opinion. Even moments that appear personal, visits to inner shrines, brief interactions with family, are framed by expectation. A wife's words may carry political implication. A child's presence may symbolize succession. Nothing inside the palace is free of meaning. This awareness never fully fades. Afternoons often bring physical fatigue, though it is never named. Long periods of sitting, standing, listening. The body endures because it must. Ramesses adjusts his pace, not his schedule. A slower walk replaces rest. A shorter audience replaces retreat. Rest itself is structured. When Ramesses withdraws to private chambers, attendants remain nearby. Silence is permitted, but not absence. Lamps are lit at prescribed times. Incense burns steadily. The same scents return day after day, anchoring time through repetition. Sleep comes late and lightly. The palace settles, but never fully quiets. Guards patrol. Servants prepare for morning. The ruler's body rests, but the institution remains awake. This constant motion without urgency creates a particular mental state. Days do not feel dramatic. They feel continuous. One blends into the next, distinguished only by minor variations, an extra report, a longer ritual, a delayed message from the border. You begin to see how this environment shapes Ramesses' sense of time. Years pass without sharp divisions. Aging is gradual and nearly invisible. The palace does not acknowledge birthdays. It acknowledges festivals, anniversaries of accession, ritual cycles. Personal milestones fade. Institutional ones endure. This has consequences. When challenges arise, foreign tensions, labor strain, political pressure, they enter a system designed to absorb disturbance slowly. This works well for minor disruptions. It works less well for sudden ones. Ramesses senses this limitation, even if he cannot alter it easily. The palace keeps Egypt stable, but it also delays reaction. Decisions must pass through layers of confirmation. Speed is sacrificed for certainty. You can feel the quiet trade-off forming beneath the routines. By now, Ramesses' daily life feels less like living and more like sustaining. He is not unhappy, but he is contained. His identity is inseparable from the palace. Outside its walls, he is Pharaoh. Inside them, he is function. When the story finally turns outward, away from palaces, temples, and routines, it does so slowly. Egypt does not rush to war. For years, the road to Kadesh exists only as reports, maps, and cautious conversations. It is not a destination yet. It is an idea forming at the edges of Ramesses' attention, growing heavier with each passing season. Kadesh lies far to the north, near the Orontes River, in a region where influence shifts quietly but constantly. It is not important because it is rich. It is important because it is symbolic. Whoever controls Kadesh controls the message sent to allies and rivals alike. Stability or weakness. Presence or retreat. You should imagine Ramesses learning about Kadesh not through excitement, but through repetition. The name appears in reports again and again. Border officials mention movement. Traders speak of unfamiliar troops. Allies write cautiously worded letters asking for reassurance. None of these messages demand immediate action. That is what makes them dangerous. Slow pressure allows doubt to grow. Egypt's rivals, especially the Hittites, do not threaten openly. They test. They wait. They watch how Egypt responds to uncertainty. In diplomacy, silence can be read as confidence or as hesitation. The difference is often decided later. Ramesses does not react publicly. Inside the palace, preparations begin quietly. Maps are unrolled. Not artistic ones, but practical sketches showing roads, water sources, travel distances. Generals discuss logistics first. How long can an army march before resupply is required? Where does the terrain narrow? Where can chariots move easily, and where must they slow? This planning is slow and unremarkable. There are no speeches, no declarations, just calculation. You begin to see how deeply Egypt's administrative mindset shapes war. Campaigns are not conceived as heroic journeys. They are supply problems waiting to happen. Food matters more than courage. Water matters more than weapons. Timing matters more than ambition. Ramesses listens carefully. He divides the army into units, each named after a god: Amun, Ra, Ptah, Seth. This is not only religious symbolism. It is organization. Each division has commanders, scribes, supply officers. Nothing moves without record. The army does not assemble quickly. Troops are drawn from across Egypt. Some are veterans. Others are newly trained. Chariots must be repaired. Horses conditioned. Armor inspected. Absences noted. Delays accepted. You can imagine how unexciting this feels compared to the idea of battle. Weeks pass without visible progress. Yet every delay reduces risk. Ramesses knows that this campaign will be watched closely. By allies. By rivals. By his own people. A failure far from Egypt would echo loudly at home. A careless victory would be worse than no victory at all. As preparations continue, messages arrive from the north, carefully phrased, incomplete, sometimes contradictory. Intelligence is unreliable. Information travels slowly. Rumors arrive faster than confirmation. This uncertainty unsettles the generals more than Ramesses. He has spent his life managing incomplete information. Rituals taught him patience. Administration taught him pattern recognition. Construction taught him endurance. War, he understands, will test all of these at once. Still, the decision must eventually be made. To march north is to leave Egypt's core. To expose the army to unfamiliar terrain. To risk being misread or misled. But not to march is to allow influence to drift without challenge. Ramesses delays just long enough to ensure readiness, and no longer. When the order finally comes, it is not dramatic. It is recorded by scribes, transmitted through command chains, understood without explanation. Egypt begins to move. The march itself is long and monotonous. Dust, heat, repetition. Days blend together. Camps are set and dismantled methodically. Rations are counted. Routes are adjusted. The army moves like an extension of Egypt's bureaucracy, steady, measured, controlled. Ramesses travels with the army, visible but guarded. He does not lead charges. He observes. He listens. His presence reassures more than it inspires. As the army approaches Kadesh, information grows scarcer and more confusing. Scouts report conflicting sightings. Locals offer guidance of uncertain reliability. Every choice feels heavier than the last. You can feel the tension tightening, not through noise or urgency, but through silence. The kind of silence that forms when decisions can no longer be delayed. As the army draws closer to Kadesh, the pace of certainty slows even further. You might expect urgency to increase as distance closes, but the opposite happens. Every step forward narrows options. Every decision becomes harder to reverse. Ramesses knows this, and so do his commanders. The march remains methodical, almost restrained, as if caution itself has become the guiding principle. Information begins to fracture. Scouts return with reports that do not align. Some speak of Hittite forces retreating. Others mention camps abandoned too neatly. A few claim the enemy king is far away, occupied elsewhere. These reports are delivered respectfully, confidently, and with just enough detail to sound convincing. Ramesses listens without reacting. This is not the first time Egypt has faced uncertain intelligence. Borders are full of people who benefit from confusion, local leaders seeking favor, traders protecting routes, informants exaggerating value. The Pharaoh knows that truth rarely arrives cleanly. Still, uncertainty is uncomfortable. The army pauses periodically, not to rest, but to recalibrate. Supply lines are checked. Units are counted. Positions are reviewed. These pauses are not signs of fear, they are attempts to restore clarity. War resists clarity. As they move deeper into unfamiliar territory, the landscape changes. Roads narrow. Water sources become less predictable. The environment itself stops cooperating. Chariots move less easily. Camps feel more exposed. Familiar rhythms break down. Ramesses feels this shift even if he does not name it. He remains visible, appearing calm, deliberate. His presence signals confidence to the troops, but inside, he weighs possibilities. He understands that reputation is fragile. One misjudgment here could undo years of careful rule. The monuments at home will not march north to correct mistakes. Messages from allies become less reassuring. Promises of support feel conditional. Silence stretches longer than expected. Each absence suggests hesitation, or calculation. The army approaches Kadesh with caution sharpened by doubt. At this stage, deception enters fully into the picture. Two captured individuals are brought before Ramesses, claiming to be deserters from the Hittite side. They tell a reassuring story. The Hittite king is far away, his army scattered, unprepared. The path ahead seems clearer after their testimony. You can imagine the relief this brings, not excitement, but release from tension. Yet something does not sit perfectly. Experienced commanders note inconsistencies. Timelines feel compressed. Details feel rehearsed. The story resolves uncertainty too neatly. Still, the testimony aligns with earlier reports. Doubt competes with desire. Ramesses must decide how much weight to give this information. He chooses movement, but cautiously. The army advances, divisions spaced carefully. Camps are established with awareness of exposure. Ramesses does not abandon caution entirely, but he allows the possibility that the threat has been exaggerated. This is the quiet danger of prolonged uncertainty. Eventually, even caution needs resolution. As Egypt's forces draw closer to Kadesh, the illusion begins to crack. More prisoners are captured. Their stories differ sharply. They speak of a Hittite force hidden nearby, waiting. The reassurance evaporates. What was quiet preparation now feels like delayed realization. The army has moved closer than intended. Ramesses faces a moment no amount of ritual or routine can smooth over. He must act with incomplete information, under pressure, with consequences that will unfold quickly. The systems that served him well in Egypt, deliberation, delayed confirmation, offer little guidance now. The battlefield does not wait. Orders are issued rapidly. Divisions are repositioned. Messengers race between units. The calm structure of the march fractures into urgency. The air thickens with dust and uncertainty. You should imagine how different this feels from palace life. No layered silence. No controlled space. Only noise, movement, and reaction. Authority must now be visible, immediate, decisive. Ramesses does not retreat. He positions himself where he can be seen. Not because it is safe, but because visibility matters. Troops fight differently when the Pharaoh is present. Courage increases. Panic slows. Presence substitutes for certainty. The Hittite forces emerge with speed and coordination. What had seemed distant is suddenly close. What had been planned as a controlled engagement becomes chaotic. Yet even in chaos, habits remain. Ramesses draws on everything that shaped him: endurance from ritual, patience from administration, discipline from construction, awareness from court politics. He does not panic. He reacts. Commands are shouted. Chariots move. Units clash. The field becomes fragmented. Victory is no longer clear. Survival becomes the immediate goal. Later histories will frame this moment dramatically. They will speak of bravery, divine favor, heroic charge. But in reality, this is a moment of uncertainty extended to its breaking point. Decisions are made not because they are perfect, but because delay is no longer possible. As the dust settles, temporarily, incompletely, Ramesses finds himself alive, visible, still commanding. The outcome is unclear. The cost is mounting. The day is not yet finished. When the dust of Kadesh finally settles, not into clarity, but into exhaustion, you begin to see war the way Ramesses sees it. Not as triumph. Not as defeat. But as something that must now be managed. The battlefield does not end when the fighting pauses. It lingers in supply shortages, wounded soldiers, scattered units, broken chariots, and uncertain messages. For Ramesses, the most difficult part of war begins after the noise fades. Egypt does not celebrate yet. First, there are counts. Who returned? Who did not? Which units are intact? Which commanders are missing? Scribes move through camps recording names, injuries, equipment losses. This is not ceremonial. It is urgent. An army cannot move forward, or home, without knowing what remains. You should imagine Ramesses not on a chariot, but seated with commanders and scribes, listening to numbers. How many horses lost? How many chariots damaged? How many days of grain left? These details decide everything that follows. Later histories will carve Kadesh's heroic struggle. Reliefs will show Ramesses alone, charging enemies with divine support. But here, in the aftermath, there is no illusion of heroism. There is only the problem of sustaining an army far from home. The Hittites have not been destroyed. Egypt has not been defeated. This ambiguity is uncomfortable. Egypt prefers clean outcomes. Ambiguity demands explanation. Ramesses understands this immediately. Before the army even begins its return, messages are drafted, not to celebrate, but to control interpretation. Reports sent south emphasize resilience, divine favor, and survival under pressure. Losses are minimized in language. Endurance is framed as victory. This is not lying. It is administration of meaning. You begin to see that war, for Egypt, is less about conquest and more about narrative stability. The empire does not need expansion right now. It needs reassurance, at home and abroad, that Egypt remains strong enough to endure challenge. Ramesses returns south not in haste, but in order. The march back is slower than the march north. Injured soldiers require transport. Units are reorganized. Camps are broken down carefully. Nothing suggests retreat. Everything suggests completion. Once back within Egypt's borders, rituals resume immediately. This matters more than you might expect. The gods must be thanked. Order must be restored publicly. The people must see continuity. Ramesses appears in ceremonies not as a returning warrior, but as a functioning pharaoh. The message is clear: whatever happened beyond Egypt did not disrupt Egypt itself. Temples receive offerings. Reliefs are planned. Scribes begin drafting inscriptions. The version of events that will endure is already taking shape. You should pause here and notice how different this is from modern ideas of war. There are no victory parades yet. No open acknowledgement of uncertainty. Egypt does not process war emotionally. It processes it structurally. Back in the palace, Ramesses resumes routine quickly. This is deliberate. The faster normality returns, the less space there is for doubt. Yet inside the administration, changes occur. Military organization is reviewed. Intelligence failures are noted quietly. Command structures are adjusted. No one is publicly blamed. Blame destabilizes. Systems are corrected instead. Ramesses treats the campaign as data. What worked? What failed? What assumptions proved dangerous? This mindset does not make legends, but it preserves empires. Foreign diplomacy resumes carefully. Messages are exchanged with the Hittites. Language is restrained. Neither side claims total victory. Both sides signal strength. This mutual restraint prevents immediate escalation. You begin to see that Kadesh was not an endpoint. It was a recalibration. Egypt's borders remain mostly unchanged. But expectations have shifted. Power must now be maintained through balance rather than dominance. War becomes something to manage, not to seek. This realization marks a turning point in Ramesses' reign. He does not become less ambitious, but he becomes more controlled. Building resumes with renewed focus. Diplomacy grows more formal. The military becomes more cautious, more prepared, less eager for symbolic confrontation. War has taught him limits. And limits, once acknowledged, reshape authority more than victory ever could. As Egypt absorbs the experience of war, You begin to notice how deliberately Ramesses reshapes its memory. The aftermath of Kadesh does not fade. It is organized. Inside the palace, scribes refine reports into official records. What began as fragmented observations becomes structured narrative. Timelines are simplified. Confusion is removed. Cause and effect are aligned neatly. This process is not about deception. It is about coherence. An empire cannot function while doubting its own story. Ramesses supervises this indirectly. He does not dictate every line. He approves themes. Strength under pressure. Divine support. Order restored. These elements repeat across inscriptions, reliefs, and ceremonial texts. The repetition is intentional. Memory in Egypt is cumulative. The army itself undergoes quiet reform. Lessons from Kadesh are absorbed into training. Reconnaissance improves. Command coordination tightens. Chariot tactics are reviewed. None of this is announced publicly. Egypt does not advertise learning through failure. What you see instead are symbols of continuity. New reliefs show Ramesses victorious. Temples depict him smiting enemies. The imagery is familiar, reassuring. To the people, this confirms that nothing has changed. To insiders, it signals that change has been carefully contained. You begin to see how war strengthens bureaucracy. Supply systems are refined. Record-keeping becomes more detailed. Military logistics align more closely with temple administration. The same methods used to track rain and stone are now applied to soldiers and horses. War becomes another branch of governance. Ramesses encourages this quietly. A well-managed war is less disruptive than an unpredictable peace. Diplomatic activity intensifies behind the scenes. Messages to the Hittites grow more formal. Tone matters more than content. Neither side wants escalation. Neither wants to appear weak. Words replace weapons carefully. You can sense the long process beginning, one that will eventually lead to a formal peace. But peace, like war, must be administered. Within Egypt, the people experience little change. Taxes continue. Festivals occur on schedule. Fields are planted and harvested. Life feels stable. This stability is not accidental. It is maintained deliberately to prevent the psychological effects of conflict. Ramesses understands that fear spreads faster than truth. Normality is the antidote. Yet internally, he becomes more cautious. He consults more often. He listens longer. He relies increasingly on trusted advisors. Authority does not diminish, it becomes distributed more efficiently. The Pharaoh learns that survival at scale requires delegation without surrender. The concept of victory evolves. Victory is no longer measured by territory gained, but by disruption avoided, by borders held, by alliances maintained, by narratives stabilized. This perspective reshapes Ramesses' self-image. He is still portrayed as heroic in stone, but in practice, he becomes a steward of equilibrium. His greatness lies not in expansion, but in endurance. This endurance allows Egypt to attempt something unprecedented. As years pass and tensions with the Hittites remain unresolved but controlled, the idea of formal peace becomes conceivable. Not truce, not pause. Peace, recorded, witnessed, and guaranteed. This possibility emerges not from idealism, but from administrative logic. Continuous conflict is expensive. Ambiguity drains resources. Stability allows planning. Ramesses does not rush toward this outcome. He allows conditions to mature. Diplomacy continues quietly, patiently, repetitively. Letters are exchanged. Terms are tested. Languages refined. Peace, like war, requires preparation. You can feel how this slow shift would surprise those expecting perpetual conquest. But Egypt has never been driven by constant aggression. It is driven by balance. Balance requires restraint. As Ramesses continues his reign, war fades into background management rather than foreground identity. His rule becomes defined by something quieter, less dramatic, but more enduring. By the time the idea of peace becomes visible, it does not arrive as relief. It arrives as paperwork. Years have passed since Kadesh. Not years of open war, but years of careful distance. Egypt and the Hittite kingdom continue to exist in each other's awareness, alert, cautious, restrained. Borders hold. Armies move less. Messages move more. For Ramesses II, this period feels familiar. It resembles administration more than conflict, which is precisely why peace becomes possible. You should imagine the earliest conversations not as negotiations, but as tests. Carefully phrased letters arrive from the north. They speak of friendship without commitment, of stability without admission, of shared interests framed as courtesy rather than need. Each word is weighed. Ramesses does not respond quickly. Speed suggests eagerness. Eagerness weakens position. Instead, replies are measured, respectful, and repetitive. Egypt acknowledges goodwill. Egypt values order. Egypt recognizes mutual benefit. Nothing is promised. Nothing is refused. The exchange continues. This is diplomacy the Egyptian way, slow, ritualized, almost boring. Behind these letters lies practical reasoning. Continuous conflict benefits no one. Egypt's resources are better spent building, maintaining, stabilizing. The Hittites face their own pressures, internal disputes, rival threats, logistical strain. Neither empire needs another Kadesh. Peace becomes less an ideal and more a solution. You begin to see how much Ramesses' earlier experiences prepared him for this moment. Ritual taught him patience. Administration taught him structure. War taught him limits. Stone taught him longevity. Peace, now, is the logical extension of all of these. Negotiations stretch across seasons. Terms are proposed, revised, returned. Each side insists on dignity. Neither admits vulnerability. Language becomes ceremonial. Gods are invoked. Witnesses named. Clauses repeat for emphasis. This repetition matters. In a world without enforcement mechanisms, repetition creates obligation. The more times a promise is written, the harder it becomes to ignore. Ramesses understands this instinctively. The treaty must feel heavy, unavoidable, sacred. Eventually, the document takes shape. It does not declare friendship. It declares balance. It speaks of mutual defense, of respecting borders, of returning fugitives, of honoring gods on both sides. It binds not just rulers, but their successors. Time itself is addressed. Future kings are named in advance. This is not optimism. It is caution formalized. When the treaty is finalized, it is not hidden. It is displayed. Copies are carved in stone. One in Egypt. One in Hatti. The words are not meant to be read daily. They are meant to exist permanently. The treaty becomes architecture. Ramesses ensures that Egypt's version emphasizes divine approval. The gods witness the agreement. The gods punish violation. Peace is not merely political, it is cosmic order restored. For the people of Egypt, little changes immediately. Life continues as before. Fields are planted. Temples operate. Festivals proceed. Peace is not felt as celebration. It is felt as absence of disruption. And absence is the greatest luxury of empire. You can imagine Ramesses standing before the carved text, aware of its significance but not dramatic about it. This treaty will not inspire songs. It will not create monuments larger than temples. But it will allow monuments to continue being built. It will allow the future to resemble the present. Yet even here, uncertainty remains. Treaties depend on memory, on successors, on restraint maintained under pressure. Stone preserves words, but not intent. The peace is real, but fragile. Once the treaty exists, carved, copied, witnessed, you might expect tension to dissolve. But peace, as Ramesses learns, does not replace vigilance. It reorganizes it. The immediate work after the treaty is not celebration. It is implementation. Copies of the agreement are distributed to temples and administrative centers. Priests are instructed on how to reference it during rituals. Officials are briefed on its clauses, especially those concerning borders and fugitives. The treaty must be known without being debated. Debate weakens authority. Ramesses understands that a treaty ignored is worse than no treaty at all. Daily governance adjusts subtly. Military patrols do not disappear, they become predictable. Border officials are instructed to resolve disputes according to the treaty's language rather than force. This requires training. Officials must learn restraint, a skill not always valued in frontier regions. The treaty also changes how intelligence is handled. Information about Hittite movements is still gathered, but urgency decreases. Reports are filed, reviewed, archived. Alarm is replaced by monitoring. The difference matters. You begin to see how peace shifts attention inward. Resources once allocated for campaigns are redirected. Construction resumes with renewed confidence. Temples expand. Infrastructure improves. Administrative reforms proceed without interruption. Stability allows long-term planning. For Ramesses, this period feels oddly familiar. It resembles the early years of his reign, steady, controlled, procedural. But now, the steadiness is reinforced externally. Egypt no longer needs to prove strength constantly. Strength is assumed. Diplomatic exchanges continue, but their tone changes. Gifts are exchanged more regularly. Messages refer back to the treaty's clauses, reinforcing shared understanding. The relationship becomes predictable, which in diplomacy is a form of trust. Yet Ramesses does not relax completely. He has learned that peace can mask new forms of competition. Influence replaces force. Cultural presence replaces armies. Trade routes matter more. Temple prestige matters more. Each side seeks advantage quietly, within the treaty's limits. Egypt responds by emphasizing visibility rather than aggression. Ramesses increases his presence in border regions through monuments and festivals. He reinforces loyalty through ceremony rather than threat. Peace becomes another stage for projection. You might notice how carefully Ramesses frames this internally. He does not speak of peace as compromise. He speaks of it as order restored. Egypt has not retreated, it has stabilized the world around it. This framing matters for succession. Future rulers will inherit this peace. They must believe it as strength, not concession. Ramesses ensures this by embedding the treaty within religious context. Gods are named as guarantors. Violating peace becomes sacrilege, not strategy. As years pass, the treaty holds. This endurance becomes part of Ramesses' legacy, even if it is less visible than stone. Few people notice when nothing happens. But rulers notice. Administrators notice. Peace allows systems to mature rather than react. Yet Ramesses also knows something quieter and more unsettling. Peace depends on continuity. On rulers who value stability. On successors who read stone not as suggestion, but obligation. He cannot control the future, only prepare it. So he does what he has always done, he reinforces patterns. Repetition strengthens memory. Ritual embeds policy. Architecture anchors intent. The treaty becomes less a document and more a background assumption, part of how the world works. As Ramesses grows older, this achievement begins to matter more to him than battles ever did. War proved his endurance. Peace proves his judgment. By the time peace settles into routine, Ramesses II returns fully to what now defines him most clearly, not war, not ritual, but building. Not the act itself, but the scale. Egypt has always built, but under Ramesses, building becomes continuous. Not a response to crisis. Not a celebration of victory. A permanent condition of the state. Stone moves through the empire the way grain once did, regularly, predictably, endlessly. You should imagine Egypt at this point as a landscape in motion. Quarries are active year after year. Transport routes along the Nile are crowded with barges carrying blocks of sandstone and granite. Work crews rotate seasonally, their movements tracked by scribes who know exactly how long a man can haul stone before exhaustion reduces efficiency. This is not chaos. It is coordination. Ramesses does not simply approve monuments. He manages a construction economy. Temples rise at Thebes, Memphis, Abydos, Abu Simbel, and dozens of smaller sites. Statues appear in pairs, rows, clusters, each reinforcing familiarity. Reliefs cover walls not because walls demand decoration, but because blank stone wastes opportunity. Every surface can speak. The official explanation is religious devotion. And that is not untrue. Temples house gods. Rituals require space. The universe needs maintenance. But beneath this lies another reality. Monuments anchor authority locally. A temple means jobs. A statue means prestige. An inscription means Egypt is present here. Ramesses builds not just for the gods, but for administrators, priests, artisans, and local elites who benefit from association with the crown. You begin to see how carefully projects are distributed. Regions that need loyalty receive attention. Border areas receive large, unmistakable symbols. Cities important to trade or administration receive restorations that link Ramesses to ancient legitimacy. Stone becomes policy. But stone is expensive. Every monument requires labor diverted from agriculture, transport diverted from trade, food diverted from storage. These costs are rarely discussed publicly, but they are recorded carefully. Scribes know how much grain feeds a workforce. Overseers know how many injuries reduce productivity. Nothing is free. Ramesses understands this, and yet he continues. Why? Because monuments do something no decree can do, they persist without enforcement. A temple does not argue. A statue does not rebel. A carved name does not forget. Once built, authority becomes environmental. But this permanence hides strain. Villages near quarries lose workers repeatedly. Fields are understaffed during certain seasons. Local officials request exemptions and delays. These requests reach the palace frame politely, never as complaint. always as circumstance. Ramesses responds selectively. Some regions receive relief, others do not. Projects are slowed, rarely stopped. The appearance of continuity matters more than speed. A monument finished slowly still signals commitment. You might expect resentment to build, but Egypt's system absorbs it quietly. Labor is organized in rotations. Workers are fed, housed, recorded. Service is temporary, but repeated. This dulls resistance. Exhaustion replaces anger. Still, the cost accumulates. As decades pass, Egypt becomes visually unified under Ramses' image. Travelers see his name everywhere. Children grow up assuming he has always ruled. This familiarity breeds acceptance, but also dependence. The state begins to rely on continuous building to maintain cohesion. Stopping would feel like decline. Ramses senses this risk, even if he does not name it. Monuments now demand maintenance. Temples require staff. Priests expect endowments. Each completed project generates future obligations. Eternity, it turns out, has operating costs. Yet Ramses does not slow. If anything, he becomes more determined. Age sharpens urgency. Time is no longer abstract. He builds faster, not recklessly, but decisively. He revisits earlier sites, orders repairs while he is alive, ensures inscriptions remain clear. Stone must remember him correctly. At night, within the palace, he is surrounded by reminders of permanence, walls carved with scenes of ideal order, statues that never age. Outside, real people age, labor, tire, recover, repeat. This contrast is never addressed openly. As the building continues year after year, you begin to notice that the cost of monuments is no longer measured only in stone or grain. It is measured in attention. Egypt's administrators spend more time managing construction than resolving local disputes. Scribes track labor rotations more carefully than village boundaries. Priests negotiate endowments and maintenance schedules alongside ritual calendars. The state's focus tilts subtly, not toward survival, but toward continuity of appearance. This shift is not accidental. It is strategic, but it carries consequences. Ramses' building program has become so extensive that stopping it would feel like failure. Every new temple sets expectations for another. Every restored shrine invites comparison. The absence of construction becomes noticeable in a way that quiet stability never was. You should imagine how this pressure feels from the center of power. Ramses does not see exhaustion in the fields. He sees reports showing productivity maintained. He does not hear complaints. He reads requests framed as logistical challenges. The system filters strain into manageable language. This is both its strength and its weakness. Monuments are planned years in advance now. Foundations laid long before walls rise. Quarries open knowing they will operate for decades. Apprentices are trained not for a single project, but for a lifetime of stonework. The economy adjusts around permanence. You begin to see how this reshapes ambition. Officials seek association with projects that will last. Local elites compete for temples rather than reforms. Visibility becomes currency. What is carved matters more than what is spoken. Ramses understands this dynamic and uses it. He ties loyalty to construction. Regions that cooperate receive investment. Temples that align with royal priorities receive expansion. Stone becomes reward, and reward becomes motivation. The system reinforces itself quietly. But beneath this smooth operation, subtle signs of fatigue appear. In some regions, Agricultural output dips during peak construction seasons. In others, transport delays affect trade. These issues are addressed individually, never collectively. Egypt does not diagnose systemic strain. It treats symptoms. This approach works, for a time. As Ramesses ages, his involvement becomes more selective. He no longer reviews every project personally. Trusted officials handle oversight. This delegation increases efficiency, but it also increases distance. Decisions are made further from consequence. Yet Ramesses does not lose control. He compensates by standardizing. Inscriptions follow templates. Reliefs repeat familiar scenes. Innovation decreases. Consistency increases. The visual language of power becomes uniform. This uniformity reassures, but it also signals rigidity. You can imagine walking through Egypt at this stage and feeling both impressed and overwhelmed. Everywhere, the same figure. The same titles. The same gestures frozen in stone. The land feels ordered, but crowded with authority. For ordinary people, this creates mixed experience. Pride exists. Egypt looks powerful. But so does fatigue. Building never ends. Service returns repeatedly. Time is marked not by change, but by repetition. Ramesses does not hear this fatigue directly. What he hears are successes. Projects completed. Temples consecrated. Statues erected. His reign is visibly unmatched. Comparisons to earlier pharaohs become inevitable, and favorable. This reinforces his path. Stone now defines his legacy more clearly than any treaty or campaign. And Ramesses leans into this definition, not out of vanity, but out of clarity. He knows what endures. He chooses to leave behind what cannot be argued with. Yet there is an irony here, quiet and unavoidable. The more Egypt invests in permanence, the less flexible it becomes. Resources are tied to maintenance. Institutions expect continued support. The future is shaped by commitments made in stone. As Ramesses approaches the later years of his reign, this reality becomes unavoidable. The monuments stand firm. The systems around them must now keep standing too. When you step away from stone and labor and return to the unseen forces shaping Ramesses II's world, you find yourself surrounded not by gods in the abstract, but by schedules. Faith in Egypt is not an occasional act. It is a daily obligation. For Ramesses, religion is not a private belief system or a source of comfort. It is work. It has hours, sequences, correct wording, correct posture, correct offerings. The gods do not demand inspiration. They demand consistency. You should imagine the religious life of the pharaoh unfolding like clockwork. Each day begins with acknowledgement of the divine order. The sun rises because it must, but also because rituals support its rising. Ramesses does not question this logic. Egypt functions because it has always believed it functions this way. Temples across the land wake early. Priests wash, dress, purify themselves. Statues of gods are treated as living beings, washed, clothed, fed. These acts are not symbolic. They are maintenance. A neglected god is a dangerous god. Ramesses stands at the center of this system, even when he is not physically present. In theory, he alone is responsible for performing rituals for all gods in all temples. In practice, priests act on his behalf. But the fiction matters. Every offering is made in his name. Every hymn invokes his role as mediator between gods and people. You begin to see how this shapes authority. Ramesses is not divine because people worship him. He is divine because he performs duties no one else can. He maintains ma'at, cosmic balance. This is not belief. It is function. Daily rituals are repetitive by design. They reduce unpredictability. They create reassurance. If yesterday's ritual worked, today's should as well. Change is risk. Ramesses participates in key ceremonies personally, especially those tied to major gods like Amun, Ra, and Ptah. These ceremonies are long and physically demanding. Standing, reciting, offering, waiting. The words are ancient. Their meaning is less important than their precision. A single mistake can offend a god. You might expect anxiety here, but there is none. Ramesses has done this his entire life. Ritual feels familiar, almost mechanical. Comfort comes from repetition, not emotion. Beyond daily rites, festivals structure the year. These are public events, processions, offerings, reenactments of mythic moments. The people see their gods carried through streets. They see the Pharaoh participating correctly. Order is confirmed visually. Festivals do not exist to inspire joy. They exist to prevent fear. Ramesses understands this deeply. He invests heavily in religious ceremony because ceremony stabilizes psychology. When gods appear content, people feel safe. Safety produces loyalty. This is not manipulation. It is maintenance of belief. You begin to notice how religion fills gaps that administration cannot. When harvests fail, priests explain imbalance. When illness spreads, rituals intensify. When foreign threats loom, gods are invoked for protection. Religion absorbs uncertainty. For Ramesses, this makes faith practical. He does not seek personal revelation. He seeks reliability. Gods who respond predictably are valuable gods. Cult centers that maintain order are supported. Those that disrupt are corrected. This approach shapes Egyptian religion subtly over time. Certain gods gain prominence because they align with state stability. Others fade quietly. Worship is not suppressed, it is redirected. Ramesses' role in this process is central but understated. He rarely introduces new beliefs. He reinforces existing ones selectively. Tradition is adjusted without being acknowledged as adjustment. As decades pass, Ramesses becomes inseparable from ritual itself. His presence defines correctness. Priests trained under his reign know no other rhythm. The gods feel familiar because the procedures never change. Yet this familiarity hides fragility. Ritual assumes continuity. It assumes tomorrow will resemble today. It assumes the Nile will flood, the sun will rise, the state will function. When these assumptions fail, ritual struggles to adapt. Ramesses senses this vulnerability, even if he cannot alter it easily. Religion maintains order, but it also resists change. When you turn away from gods, treaties, and monuments, and look instead at Ramesses II as a father, the scale of his life shifts again. This time inward, but not smaller. Family, in the royal world, is never private. For Ramesses, family is continuity made visible. Sons and daughters are not simply children. They are proof that the order he maintains will outlast him. Their existence reassures the court, the priesthood, and the people that Egypt will continue without disruption. You should imagine the royal family not as a household, but as a network. Ramesses has many wives, as tradition allows and expects. Each marriage carries political, religious, or symbolic meaning. Some wives strengthen alliances. Others reinforce legitimacy through lineage. One holds the title of Great Royal Wife, a role defined less by intimacy and more by ceremony. Royal mothers matter deeply in this system. The great royal wife appears beside Ramesses in temples and reliefs. She participates in rituals. She embodies stability and fertility. Her visibility reassures the public that the royal line is secure. Her silence is as important as her presence. Other wives manage their own households within the palace complex. These households are busy, structured spaces, staffed, supervised, recorded. Each has its own hierarchy, its own routines, its own quiet rivalries. Nothing here is chaotic. Everything is regulated. Children move between these spaces under constant supervision. Ramesses has many children, sons and daughters spread across decades of his long reign. They are introduced to the public carefully. Names are recorded. Titles assigned. Appearances are staged. A child's visibility matters as much as their birth. You might expect warmth or affection to dominate these relationships, but in the palace, responsibility comes first. Sons are trained early. They learn reading, ritual, etiquette, and later, military organization. Some accompany Ramesses on campaigns or inspections, not to fight, but to be seen. Visibility creates legitimacy. Legitimacy creates order. Daughters play different roles, but no less important ones. They participate in ceremonies, represent continuity, and in some cases, serve religious functions. Their presence reinforces the image of abundance and stability. In Egypt, a thriving royal family suggests divine favor. Ramesses ensures that his children are everywhere, on reliefs, in inscriptions, in processions. This is not pride. It is policy. A visible dynasty discourages uncertainty. Yet this abundance creates complexity. Succession becomes less clear as years pass. Multiple sons grow into adulthood. Some die. Others rise. Titles shift. Favor appears to move subtly, never explained openly. The court watches closely. Everyone wants to know who matters most. Ramesses manages this ambiguity carefully. He does not name a single heir too early. Certainty invites competition. Instead, he allows hierarchy to form gradually through ritual roles, military appointments, and public appearances. Power accumulates slowly around certain figures without being declared outright. This approach preserves stability, but it also delays resolution. Family life inside the palace follows routine just like everything else. Meals are structured. Education is scheduled. Interactions are observed. Children learn early that they are always being watched, not because they are distrusted, but because they matter. You can imagine how this shapes personality. Freedom is limited. Curiosity is guided. Identity is tied to role rather than desire. Ramesses experiences fatherhood through this lens. He provides structure rather than intimacy, protection rather than closeness. His children know him more as presence than personality. This distance is not cruelty. It is necessity. A pharaoh cannot be only a father. He must remain something larger. As years pass, Ramesses outlives many of his children. Death becomes familiar. Funerals follow ritual. Mourning is formalized. Loss is absorbed into ceremony. Life inside the palace continues. This repetition dulls grief but deepens endurance. By the later years of his reign, Ramesses is surrounded by descendants, sons, daughters, grandchildren, forming a living image of continuity. The palace feels full, yet impersonal. Generations overlap. Time compresses. When Ramesses II reaches old age, something unusual happens. He does not fade. Most pharaohs rule briefly, disappear, and are replaced before memory fully settles. Ramesses remains. year after year, decade after decade, so long that Egypt begins to forget what change feels like. You should imagine what that does to a society. Children are born, grow up, and become officials knowing no other ruler. Priests are trained under his name alone. Scribes copy texts that assume his authority as a constant. For many Egyptians, Ramesses is not one pharaoh among many, he is the pharaoh. Time bends around him. Physically, age cannot be hidden forever. His movements slow. His body stiffens. Pain becomes part of daily routine. But none of this is acknowledged publicly. Statues remain youthful. Reliefs show strength. Inscriptions speak in eternal present tense. Stone does not age. And Egypt prefers stone to flesh. Inside the palace, accommodations adjust quietly. Audiences are shorter. Standing rituals include discreet supports. Travel becomes less frequent. Authority adapts without announcing itself. The illusion of timelessness must remain intact. You begin to see how deeply Egypt depends on this illusion. Ramesses is no longer simply ruling Egypt, he is anchoring it psychologically. His continued presence suggests divine favor. If the gods allow him to live so long, the order of the world must be secure. This belief is powerful. Priests reinforce it. They emphasize his unique relationship with the gods. His longevity becomes proof of cosmic balance. Festivals celebrate not just events, but endurance. Survival itself becomes sacred. For Ramesses, this stage of life is quieter, but heavier. He delegates more. Trusted officials handle daily matters. Systems run without direct intervention. This is not withdrawal. It is transition. The ruler becomes less visible in action and more visible in symbol. Yet even symbols require maintenance. Ramesses reviews monuments built decades earlier. He orders repairs. Names are recarved where erosion threatens memory. Temples are refreshed. The past must remain present. At the same time, death becomes less abstract. Funerals occur more often. Long-serving officials pass away. Priests who once trained him are gone. Generals retire or die. Continuity persists, but faces change. Ramesses outlives many who knew him as a man rather than an institution. This isolation is subtle but real. He is surrounded by people, yet few remember his youth. Fewer still speak to him without reverence. Familiarity disappears. Respect deepens. Conversation narrows. The palace grows quieter, not in sound, but in spontaneity. Succession remains a quiet undercurrent. Many sons have already died. Others age alongside him. The question of who will follow him lingers unresolved, managed through gradual elevation rather than declaration. Egypt avoids sudden transitions whenever possible. Ramesses understands this risk better than anyone. His reign has lasted so long that the system has adjusted to him personally. Removing him will require careful rebalancing. He prepares indirectly. He reinforces institutions rather than individuals. He strengthens temples, bureaucracy, ritual continuity. He ensures that when change comes, it will move through systems, not emotion. This is the final responsibility of a long-lived ruler, making absence survivable. You can imagine Ramesses in these years not as anxious, but reflective. He has done what Egypt asked of him, maintained order, projected strength, endured uncertainty. Now, endurance itself defines him. But endurance has limits. When Ramesses II finally becomes old enough that memory begins to replace experience, something subtle happens across Egypt. People stop talking about what he does and begin talking about what he has always been. For farmers along the Nile, Ramesses is no longer a ruler who issues decrees. He is the name spoken in temple prayers, the figure carved on pylons they pass without thinking, the authority assumed in tax records, land boundaries, and festival calendars. His presence fades into background certainty. You should imagine what that feels like. Most people never meet him. They do not hear his voice or see his face. They know him through repetition, through stone images worn smooth by sun and wind, through phrases spoken by priests who were trained by priests before them. Memory becomes inherited rather than personal. In this way, Ramesses becomes part of the environment. Children grow up believing Egypt has always looked this way. The temples seem ancient, even when they are new. The statues feel permanent, even when they are recent. Ramesses' name is everywhere, so it feels timeless. This familiarity creates a quiet kind of loyalty. People do not praise him loudly. They accept him. Acceptance is stronger than enthusiasm. Enthusiasm fades. Acceptance endures. Among officials and scribes, memory takes a more deliberate shape. Records are copied. Inscriptions are maintained. Comparisons are made with earlier rulers, and increasingly, Ramesses comes out ahead. Not because he was flawless, but because he was constant. A long reign becomes its own virtue. Priests emphasize his piety. Builders emphasize his generosity. Soldiers emphasize his survival. Each group remembers the version of Ramesses that aligns with their experience. None of these versions are false. They are incomplete. In villages, stories simplify. Ramesses becomes the king who built everything. The king who lived forever. The king who kept enemies away. Details blur. Timelines compress. Events merge. Kadesh becomes victory. Peace becomes strength. Construction becomes divine favor. You begin to see how myth forms without intention. Ramesses does not control this process directly, but his reign has prepared for it. Repetition ensures consistency. Stone reinforces memory. Ritual keeps names alive. Egypt's culture does not question what endures, it trusts it. This trust has consequences. Later rulers struggle to measure up. Their reigns feel short by comparison. Their monuments feel small. Their authority feels temporary. Ramesses' memory raises expectations that few can meet. Yet for ordinary people, this is not disappointment. It is nostalgia. Stability remembered often feels better than stability lived. As years pass, Ramesses' living presence recedes, but his image grows sharper. Distance smooths flaws. Time filters difficulty. What remains is reliability. You can imagine an old farmer explaining Egypt to a child, "This is how it has always been." And in that statement, Ramesses lives on, not as a man, but as a standard. But memory is selective. The cost of monuments fades. The exhaustion of labor is forgotten. The ambiguity of war disappears. What remains is the impression of order without effort. This is not deception. It is human memory doing what it always does, preserving comfort over complexity. As Ramesses' name becomes less associated with the present and more with the past, Egypt adjusts. Life continues. The Nile floods. Fields are planted. Rituals repeat. When Ramesses II finally dies, Egypt does not stop. This is the first thing you need to understand. There is no pause for shock, no space for confusion. The system he spent a lifetime maintaining moves forward immediately, quietly, efficiently, without visible emotion. Death, in Egypt, is not an interruption. It is a transition already planned for. You should imagine the moment not as dramatic, but controlled. The palace becomes still, but not chaotic. Servants follow procedures learned long ago. Priests are summoned. Scribes prepare records. Guards adjust positions. News spreads carefully, not through rumor, but through channels designed to preserve calm. The pharaoh is dead, but Egypt must continue to function as if order itself has not been touched. Ramses' body is moved discreetly. There is no public display yet. What follows is work. Mummification is not a spiritual act first. It is a technical process. Specialists take over immediately, priests trained in embalming, assistants skilled in cutting, cleaning, drying, wrapping. Each step follows tradition refined over centuries. Nothing is improvised. The procedure exists because it has always existed. The body is washed. Organs are removed carefully and preserved separately. The heart remains. It must. In the afterlife, the heart will be weighed. Memory, morality, identity, all are believed to reside there. You might expect reverence to dominate this moment, but what dominates instead is precision. Natron is applied to dry the body. Days are counted. Conditions are monitored. Timing matters. Too little drying leads to decay. Too much damages form. Eternity depends on accuracy. Ramses' status does not change the procedure. It multiplies it. The materials used are finer. The rituals longer. The inscriptions more elaborate. But the logic is the same. Even a god-king must obey the process. Death does not exempt, it enforces. You begin to see how deeply bureaucratic Egypt's afterlife is. Amulets are selected according to specific rules. Each protects a function: speech, sight, movement, memory. They are placed deliberately, not symbolically. Placement matters as much as presence. Words are spoken precisely. Spells are recited without deviation. This is not prayer. It is instruction. The coffin is prepared in layers: wood, gold, inscriptions. Names repeated again and again. Ramses' identity must be impossible to lose. In the afterlife, confusion is dangerous. The dead must know who they are, and the gods must recognize them instantly. You can imagine the sheer volume of documentation involved. Funerary texts copied. Ritual calendars followed. Inventory lists checked. Nothing is assumed. Everything is confirmed. This is Egypt's final act of administration for its ruler. Outside, the people continue their lives. Fields are planted. Markets open. Temples perform daily rites. Egypt does not publicly mourn yet, not because Ramses is unimportant, but because stability must come first. A delayed reaction prevents panic. Inside the tomb complex, planned long before death, preparations continue. Goods are arranged. Furniture, clothing, food offerings, symbolic tools. These are not comforts. They are necessities. The afterlife is imagined as structured, hierarchical, demanding. Ramses will need status there as he had here. The walls of the tomb are painted with scenes of judgment, travel, transformation. Instructions line the passages. Doors are sealed in stages. Each chamber exists for a reason. This is not decoration. It is navigation. You begin to understand that for Egypt, death is not an ending, it is a relocation. And like all relocations, it requires paperwork. Ramses' successor is prepared to step forward. Titles are transferred. Ritual authority shifts smoothly. The living king must appear quickly. Delay creates vulnerability. Egypt cannot exist without a visible anchor. So the transition overlaps. While Ramesses is prepared for eternity, Egypt is already adjusting to the present. This overlap is intentional. It prevents rupture. No moment exists where Egypt is without order. The funeral itself, when it occurs, is formal and restrained. Public grief is ritualized. Emotion is contained within ceremony. The people see continuity, not loss. The king lives on, in stone, in ritual, in memory. And beneath all of this structure, one quiet truth remains. Even the greatest ruler becomes a body that must be dried, wrapped, labeled, stored. Long after the rituals stop, long after the priests fall silent, and long after Egypt itself changes language, rulers, and gods, Ramesses II waits. Not consciously. Not symbolically. Physically. His body, once prepared with obsessive care, is moved again and again over centuries, hidden, reburied, protected from tomb robbers, transferred by priests who no longer serve as gods but still respect his importance. Even in decline, Egypt continues to manage him. You should imagine how quiet these centuries are. Dynasties rise and fall. Foreign rulers arrive. New religions replace old ones. Temples collapse or are repurposed. Ramesses monuments remain, but their meaning fades. People see statues without knowing names. Stone endures, but memory thins. Eventually, even the caretakers disappear. When the modern world finally encounters Ramesses again, it does not recognize him as a god or king. It recognizes him as an artifact. This shift matters. European travelers in Egypt notice the scale first. Colossal statues. Endless inscriptions. A single name repeated obsessively. Scholars begin to ask questions not out of reverence, but curiosity. Who built all this? Why does one ruler dominate the landscape so completely? Ramesses becomes a problem to solve. His name is translated. His cartouches are catalogued. His reliefs are compared. Chronologies are debated. What Egypt preserved through ritual, the modern world reconstructs through measurement. You begin to see how differently time works now. Stone that once guaranteed eternity becomes data. Monuments become evidence. Statues become specimens. Ramesses is no longer eternal, he is ancient. When his mummy is eventually uncovered, the process is clinical. Scientists examine bones, teeth, injuries. Age is estimated. Health is analyzed. The body that once symbolized divine order becomes a source of information. This is not disrespect. It is transformation. Ramesses' long life, once proof of divine favor, becomes a medical curiosity. Arthritis is identified. Dental problems noted. The physical cost of endurance is revealed. The God King becomes a human body again. And yet, something of his intention survives. Even stripped of ritual meaning, his preparation worked. His name is intact. His face is recognizable. His reign is reconstructible. The systems he trusted, stone, repetition, procedure, outlasted belief itself. Modern Egypt treats him differently again. He becomes heritage, identity, tourism, national memory. His image appears in museums, textbooks, documentaries. He is no longer worshipped, but he is still central, still unavoidable. You might notice the irony here. Ramesses built to be eternal within his worldview, and instead became eternal in another. Not through gods, but through history. Not through ritual, but through study. Yet even this form of endurance is conditional. Modern attention shifts. New discoveries emerge. Other figures compete for focus. Ramesses remains important, but not singular. Eternity fragments.